In this segment, I want to discuss the revitalization of Chinese traditional culture, essentially under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping was not the immediate successor of Mao Zedong. When Mao Zedong died in September of 1976, his hand-picked successor, a man named Hua Guofeng, came to power. Mao was suspicious of his second-in-command. He killed off two of them. And Hua Guofeng only made it because Mao Zedong died before Mao could get tired of him and gotten rid of him. Mao picked an incredibly weak individual, someone whose only political experience was being the mayor of the village in which Mao Zedong had been born, whose greatest accomplishment was to create a hometown museum in honor of Mao Zedong. I mean, this is talk about taking someone from nowhere and making them into a star. He was the ultimate rapid riser. But he was totally incompetent and was easily moved out by older Communist Party leaders who had decided that the person who really could lead China in the future was Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping led a revolution, it's often said. In reality, what Deng Xiaoping did was dismantle the revolution. He dismantled the Communist Revolution and allowed the underlying Confucian system to emerge. So what did he have to do? Well, he faced a staggering problem. He faced a country in which the average income in Western dollars was about $200 a year. That's not even $1 a day. And, so people were in massive starvation, or massive poverty, verging on starvation in many sections of the country. The country was divided into urban and rural, according to a very strict system, which said that people who lived in rural areas could not move into the cities except under extraordinary circumstances. What were the extraordinary circumstances? Well, if a city resident had very good connections with the Communist Party, he could marry someone in a rural section and bring them to the city. But ordinarily, even an urban resident would be forced to move back to the countryside if they married someone who did not have an urban address. People who were in the People's Liberation Army were in some cases, with very distinguished service, with lots of political connections, able to move into the cities. But otherwise, there was a complete segregation of urban and rural. Why? Well, because those people who lived in the cities got regular salaries, and they were supported with food and housing and clothing, and all of it was rationed, and it wasn't in plentiful supply, but it was sufficient to maintain their needs. In the countryside, they were entirely at the discretion of Mother Nature. They were forced to raise everything they could, and when they raised it, they were forced to give their surplus to support the cities. Life in the countryside was incredibly hard. It was all in a long system of so-called communist features, like communes and collective farms and so on. And these were, at their worst, not productive. How unproductive were they? Well, this had happened in other communist countries. What happened is when you tried to make farmers work on communal farms or state farms, their productivity fell to virtually nothing. There was a period of time when Mao was in charge, when in the countryside, peasants were allowed to keep small garden plots next to their house. That's all they had that they could raise and keep for themselves. And there were years where half of the entire agricultural production of China came from 4% of the land. 50% of the agricultural production came from 4% of the land. The other 50% on state-controlled farms came from 96% of the land. How massively inconvenient was that? All of this was in order to maintain a system in which the cities could live off the benefits of the people in the countryside. Now, the cities were not very productive because, of course, the whole system was massively inefficient. half the land is used, half the agricultural production comes from 4% of the land, and the other 96% is wasted. You're not going to feed very many city people with that kind of a system. And they didn't. So, the first and most critical step in changing China back was to allow individual farmers to begin to use a household responsibility system. Now, the Chinese who had grown up under communism were somewhat reluctant to change. They had grown used to this notion of communes, and although it wasn't very productive, in at least the good years, they were able to feed themselves. It took a while for some of them to adapt. But at all points, there were people in the Chinese system who could see the failure of the communes and of the collective farms, and who wanted to go back to a household responsibility system. And these people pressed forward. Under Deng Xiaoping, with the recognition of how inefficient the system was, essentially what the government did was it allowed a grassroots effort to emerge from the countryside, from people in the countryside who said, please let us go back to household farming, to let the household be in control of its own land, which had been the historic pattern for 2,000 years. The Chinese government gave way and allowed the household responsibility system to start up in selected provinces. And it spread like wildfire. It spread like wildfire in part because people recognized that they were going to eat, and eat better if they had the household responsibility system. And very soon, it wasn't long before people in villages that did not have the household responsibility system said, well, if I have children, I want my children to marry into these other villages. The women, we want the women to go over there, at least they won't starve to death if they're in a household responsibility village. And men from these villages would seek brides from the villages that had the household responsibility system so that they could gain some kind of access to that other system, and also so that they could see, the wives that they brought into their villages could give them tips on how they could do it. It was no time at all before the farmers changed China. In order to help you with this segment of the class, I'm asking you to take a look at some material written by a Chinese scholar. Her PhD is from Princeton. She is currently a full professor at the University of Hawaii. Her name is Kate Xiao Zhou, and her book is How the Farmers Changed China. It is easily one of the best books on contemporary China. It's important that you start to read this book before we look at the next video. The next video will be called All Under Heaven. It's a part of a trilogy of videos called The Small Village of China that were filmed by a Carmelita or Karma Hinton, who is now today a professor at Princeton University. This particular video, All Under Heaven, will have a number of features. It will talk about the great Chinese festival, the Chinese New Year, which falls somewhere between the middle of January to the middle of February. And it shifts from year to year based on the lunar calendar rather than on the solar calendar used in the West. It will also talk about some other customs like marriage ceremonies in China and funeral ceremonies in China. But one part of it was going to be a discussion of the transfer of authority from the commune to the household responsibility system. And you'll hear both sides of the argument, because you'll hear some people who were dissatisfied with this proposed change. And you will, over the course of the 3 videos that we're going to watch, see a fundamental transfer to the household responsibility system, with the household responsibility system winning out. Now, this is all about the countryside. And yet, if you look at China's economic progress, your first reaction is, but all of it's in the cities. What the Chinese are doing is not being better farmers today. They have a manufacturing empire that is churning out a tremendous percentage of all the manufactured goods in use in the world today. So what about the cities? Well, the critical thing is that the cities began to expand. As the farmers improved their productivity, it turned out that all of the people who had been involved in farming were wasting their time. That much of what had happened is people were enforced into a system of feudalism, or slavery in this very inefficient system. They were working on the farm, but they weren't working very well, and they weren't working very efficiently. When the household responsibility system came in, another change in the Maoist system was to allow people who wanted to move from the rural areas to the cities to do so. In other words, they just simply stopped enforcing the old passport system, and people flowed into the cities, where there was a tremendous increase in the available labor. And indeed, there was one point in which it was talked about how 100 million people had left the farms and moved into the cities, which would be one of the most massive migrations in the history of mankind. And indeed, the 100 million I just cited is almost certainly an understatement, because massive, massive numbers of people, possibly another 100 million higher than that, moved into the cities, where they became low-income employees. And this fueled a tremendous amount of economic progress in the cities, in the factories. And so each of the manufacturing centers had a ready supply of labor at a very low cost. And they were not lacking in talent. The notion that the Chinese were ignorant was only based on the inefficient system in which they operated. All of the Chinese that I've seen when I visited the countryside were perfectly capable of understanding most economic principles and most mechanical principles, how to farm. And indeed, if you look carefully in the videos we're going to see, you'll see a number of circumstances in which those who are speaking to us speak to us with a ready understanding of economic progress. In fact, they're not very good Marxists at all. They're terrible Marxists, they're terrible communists, they're wonderful capitalists. They have a clear understanding of how the economic system operates. And this becomes absolutely critical as we go forward in the remaining third